How are you guys doing? Today is Monday, May 2nd, 2002. I'm James Sims, and for this episode of The Elite, I'm going to do an elite individual profile on Paul George. The elite starting small forward for the Los Angeles Clippers turns 32, and what I'm going to do with this episode is, of course, point out what in Paul George has led him to where he is right now, as Paul George is one of the best two-way basketball players on the planet. Standing in at about 6'8", 220, Paul George is probably one of the smoothest scorers and just one of the best just off-ball operators that you really see in the NBA. I think that because he's in his prime alongside other players, his greatness isn't really being appreciated right now because you haven't really seen like the alternative. I think there have been moments where Paul George has probably come up shorter than people would expect him to, but I mean that doesn't mean people should forget like all of the greatness that Paul George has really brought to the game. He's had a lot of crazy moments. And I think that Paul George is right back in the mix. And I think that as soon as he has his feet right back under him and he has the right teammates, Paul George can definitely make a team a contender. And of course, what I'm going to do with this episode is, of course, I'm going to zoom in and look at what he's done in his career from Fresno State to the league. And of course, I'm going to analyze how he's been able to impact the game on a micro level, game in, game out, every single season, and look at how he's been able to impact the game on a macro level. He did travel with the Olympic team and win a gold medal, and not to mention he was going to compete in the FIBA Basketball World Cup before he broke his leg, but Paul George is definitely a player that's made the game of basketball a better global sport just by his presence. So with that said, going into his career, originally coming out of Palmdale, California, he would go on to play basketball at Fresno State. I imagine he was looking for better prospects. As he would go on to be verbally committed to Santa Clara, but then he decommitted from them. But then after choosing Fresno State, he would go on to play 2 seasons at Fresno State. His very first season at Fresno State would be his age 18 season, as his age 18 season would be in 2008-2009. In that season, Fresno State would go on to go 13-21 under Steve Cleveland in his third to last season coaching the team. In that season, Paul George would go on to average about 35 minutes a game. In those 35 minutes a game, as a freshman, he would go on to average 14.3 points while shooting 47% from the field, 44% from three, and about 70% from the free throw line. Alongside his 14 points, he was averaging 6.2 rebounds, almost 2 assists, 1.7 steals, and he was averaging a smooth block a game. And this is all being a freshman while playing in the WAC. Following that first season, he would, of course, do a lot in his game to, of course, make himself a better prospect the next year. His sophomore season there would see him start all 29 of the games he played in a season where Fresno State would end up going 15-8. Or 15-18. They had won 2 more games in the previous year, and after that year, Steve Cleveland only had 1 more year with the team before Rodney Terry took his place. In Paul George's second season with Fresno State, he would go on to see his minutes dip down from he lost about a minute per game as he was averaging 33 of them. He would average 16.8 points per game, about 2.5 more points in his freshman season. He did all this while shooting 42% from the field, 35% from three, and 90% from the free throw line. His field goal and 3-point numbers went down a bit as his volume went up, but his free throw numbers definitely went up. His 16.8 points would be averaged alongside 7.2 rebounds a game. He also averaged 3 assists. He averaged 2.2 steals. Very tough to average over 2 steals a game. After his second season at Fresno State, he would go on to make the second team All-WAC, as of course the team wasn't necessarily good, but Paul George was a standout player. Following his 2 seasons at Fresno State, he would be taken with the 10th overall pick in the 2010 NBA draft, as other names in that draft include John Wall. John Wall was the first overall pick in that draft out of Kentucky by the Wizards. DeMarcus Cousins was taken out of Kentucky by Sacramento with the 5th overall pick. And the pick right ahead of him was Gordon Hayward, after Gordon Hayward had missed a chance to win the game, the national championship game over Duke. But of course, Paul George was in that draft to give you a sense of the players that he came up with. He was actually the lowest drafted all-star in his draft. But of course, In addition to that, once he was drafted by the Indiana Pacers, he would go on to play what would be 7 seasons there. His very first season in Indiana was his age 20 season in 2010-2011. He would go on to start 19 of the 61 games he played in a season where the Indiana Pacers would end up going 37-45. They would go on to win 5 more games than the previous season, as they had made the playoffs for the first time following a 4-year drought. In Paul George's very first season in the playoffs, in his very first season, he would go on to earn his way into the starting ranks, as after his rookie season, only during his injury season did he not start every single game of every game that he played. But in that season where he would come off the bench a bit, he would average about 21 minutes. He would average 7.8 points while shooting 45% from the field, 29% from 3 with less than 1 three-pointer made a game, and he went on to shoot 76% from the foul line. Alongside his 7.8 points, he averaged 3.7 rebounds, just over an assist, and he averaged a steal per game. And once this season would come to an end, he would go on to he would make the second all-rookie team, and within that year, the Indiana Pacers would go on to lose in the very first round to the Chicago Bulls. This is the season in which the Heat would make it out the East, go to the finals, and then lose to the Dallas Mavericks. Paul George's second season in the NBA would be his second year with the Indiana Pacers. In 2011-2012, during the lockout season, he would start all 66 of the games he played for an Indiana Pacers side that would end up going 42-24. Even with less games, they had won 5 more games than the previous year, as they had gone from 8th to 3rd in the East. This is the year where Larry Bird won the Executive of the Year. In Paul George's second season with the Indiana Pacers, he would average just under 30 minutes a game, this was his very first season being a full-time starter at 21 years old. He would average 12.1 points per game, averaging 4.5 more points than his rookie year. He did all this while shooting 44% from the field, 38% from 3, and he would go on to shoot 80% from the foul line. Alongside his 12 points, Paul George averaged 5.5 rebounds, 2.5 assists, and 1.5 steals per game, making it the second year in a row he's averaging at least a steal a game, and he was able to do that quite a bit in Indiana. Once that season would come to an end, Paul George and the Pacers would end up winning their very first playoff series for Paul George, as they beat the Magic in 5. They would end up losing in the conference semifinals to the Miami Heat, who were led by LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, and Chris Bosh. That was the season where LeBron James would actually win his very first NBA title under Eric Spoelstra, and the Heat would win their second in franchise history. Or no, they'll win their third in franchise history. Or their second in franchise history. And then following that 2012 season, this would lead to Paul George's third season with the Indiana Pacers. This would be the season where Paul George really jumped up into that level, as in 2013, Paul George would actually be named the most improved player of the year. In his third season with Indiana, in his second season as a starter in his age 22 season, Paul George would go on to start 79 games in a season where the Indiana Pacers finished with a 49-32 record. That's 12 more wins than their last full season. And in Paul George's most improved player season, he would see himself go from averaging 30 minutes a game to 37 minutes a game, as he would average literally, 8 more minutes a game than he had his sophomore season. He would see his points go up from 12 to 17.4, all while shooting 42% from the field, 36% from 3, and he shot 80% from the foul line. This would be the second year in a row he shot at least 35% from 3, which is so very impressive. Alongside his 17.4 points, he would go on to average 7.6 rebounds, the most rebounds that he would average at least up until that point in his career in almost every season but one. He would go on to finish with 4.1 assists on the year, the first time he would eclipse 4 assists in a season. He would average 1.8 steals, which is a career high for him at that point. And once that season came to an end, like I said, he would be named to an all-star team for the first time. He would be named to the All-NBA third team as well, and the second team All-NBA defense. And this would be the very first year he started earning all these accolades. Once the Indiana Pacers went to the playoffs, they would end up beating the Atlanta Hawks in 6 games. They would go on to beat the New York Knicks in the conference semifinals in 6 games. And then they would go on to the conference final where they would lose to the Heat in 7 games. The Heat would go on to the finals where they would go on to beat this time they were going to beat the San Antonio Spurs as they had beaten the Thunder the year before. This would be when LeBron would be a repeat champion, repeat finals MVP, and when Dwayne Wade picked up his 3rd championship. Following this would transition into Paul George's 2nd All-Star season, and where would he go from there? In 2013-2014, in his 4th season with the Pacers, he would go on to start all 80 of the games he played in a season where the Pacers would go on to finish with a 56-26 record. They would go on to finish with the best record in the East for the first time since 2004, and they have not had the best record in the East since 2013-2014. And in that season where Paul George would take the Indiana Pacers above and beyond, he would go on to average 36 minutes, which is what he averaged the year before, maybe a minute and a half less. He would go on to average 21.7 points. This would be the first time he broke the 20 points a game barrier. He did all this while shooting 42% from the field, 36% from 3, and he shot 86% from the foul line. Alongside his 21 points, he averaged 7 rebounds, 3.5 assists, and 2 steals. And once that season would come to a close, he would go on to be named an All-Star for the 2nd year in a row. He was named to the All-NBA 3rd team for the 2nd year in a row. And he would go on to be named to the All-Defensive 1st team for the very first time in his NBA career. Once the Indiana Pacers made it to the playoffs, they would end up beating the Hawks in 7. They beat the Hawks in the first round for the 2nd year in a row. They would go on to beat the Washington Wizards in the conference semifinals before eventually losing in the conference finals to the Heat. This would be the 3rd year in a row they lost to the Heat in the playoffs. And that's the last time that they would make it to the conference finals, or better yet, out of the first round since that season. But in that 2014 season, that would be the season where Paul George really kind of stepped it up as the two-way player that everyone really expected him to be. Following that 2013-14 season, he went to try to compete with the U.S. basketball team for the FIBA Basketball World Cup. And then in a video, in a sequence that everyone really kind of saw, Paul George did end up breaking his leg, which would take him out for most of the upcoming season, the 2014-2015 season. In that season, Paul George would only play about 5 games of that year, as he did come back at the very end. He played the final 6 games of the season for an Indiana Pacers team. They ended up going 38-44. That was the only time that Paul George was there that they ended up missing the playoffs, which should show his importance to the team. Without him, they were the 9th best team. They had won 18 less games without him in the lineup. But whatever, in those 6 games that he played, he would average 15 minutes, and in those 15 minutes, he averaged about 9 points, 4 rebounds, and maybe an assist a game. Following his injury season, he would come back and for his 6th season with the Indiana Pacers in his age 25 season. He would go on to start all 81 of the games he played in a season where the Indiana Pacers would finish with a 45-37 record. In Paul George's comeback season, Paul George would go on to average about 35 minutes a game, which was about what he was doing his last full year in the league. He would go on to average 23.1 points, which at that point was a career high for him, the second time he eclipsed 20 points a game, all while shooting 42% from the field, 37% from 3, and he went on to shoot 86% from the foul line. So, of course, his shooting numbers were pretty much on par with what he was doing, if not getting a little better. Alongside his 23 points, he averaged 7 rebounds for the second time in his career. He also averaged 4.1 assists for the second time in his career as well. He averaged 1.9 steals, making it the 5th season that he averaged at least 1. In the 4th season, his 4th full season in a row, that he averaged at least a steal and a half. Following that 2015-16 season, Paul George would be named an All-Star for the 3rd time in that 4-year stretch. He would go on to be named to the All-NBA 3rd team for the 3rd time in a 4-year stretch as well. He would go on to be named to the All-Defensive 2nd team for the 2nd time in his career as well. He has not made the All-Defensive 2nd team since that year. And then following his first year back, the Indiana Pacers would end up going to the playoffs, so they would lose in the very first round to the Toronto Raptors. This would be the season where LeBron James, Kyrie Irving, and the Cleveland Cavaliers would be the team coming out the East, come from behind and pull off an incredible come-from-behind finals victory against the Golden State Warriors, for context. But of course, that was that season. This would lead into Paul George's seventh and final season with the Indiana Pacers. In his age 26 season in 2016-17, he would go on to start all 75 of the games he played for an Indiana Pacers team that went 42-40. They had 3 less wins than the year before, as they still finished with the 7th best record in the East. Going into the playoffs this year, Paul George would go on to average 36 minutes a game, roughly what he was doing before. He would average 23.7 points per game, which was half a point more than what he had done the year before, which would then take the place of his career high. He would average 24 points a game almost, while shooting 46% from the field, which was by far the highest field goal percentage he had shot in a full season, and to this day, the highest field goal percentage he shot in a full season. He would go on to shoot 39% from three, which is also a high percentage for him, at least within a full season. That was his career high. He would go on to shoot 89% from the free throw line, nearly 90%. I imagine he was like a couple free throws away from 90. And alongside his 23.7 points per game in his last season in Indy, he would go on to average 6.6 rebounds. This would be the 4th time that he would average at least 6 rebounds. He would average 3.3 assists, 1.6 steals, making it the 5th time in a 6-year stretch that he would average a steal and a half. And of course, that 1-year break being the year that his leg broke. And then in 2016-17, once that season would come to an end, Paul George would be named a All-Star for the 4th year in a row, making sure that he was an All-Star for a majority of his tenure in Indianapolis. He would go on, or I guess that would be his honor for his last season in Indianapolis. Once they made it to the playoffs, they would actually end up getting swept by the Cleveland Cavaliers, as the Cavaliers made it right back to the finals, where they lost in 5 to a Golden State Warriors team who now additionally had Kevin Durant. Following that, this would lead to Paul George's first season playing for Oklahoma City, as with Kevin Durant leaving, that created an opening in Oklahoma City, as Russ wanted to play in Oklahoma City with a top-level two-way small forward. And he would go on to get moved to Oklahoma City for the 2017-2018 season. He was actually traded in exchange for Victor Oladipo and Domantas Sabonis. And in that season, in his very first season in Oklahoma City, which would be his 8th season in the league, he would go on to start all 79 of the games he played for an Oklahoma City Thunder team that would eventually go on and finish with a 48-34 record. They had won one more game than the previous year, in which Russell Westbrook had won the MVP under Billy Donovan. But in that season, Paul George would go on to help, like I said, he helped the Thunder finish with the 4th best record in the West in the playoff, or in the regular season first. He would go on to average about 36.6 minutes a game. And while playing for a new team, he'd average 21.9 points per game, a tick below what he did the year before, but it would be the 4th season in which he averaged at least 20 points a game. He did all this while shooting 43% from the field. He shot 40% from 3 in a full season for the very first time in his NBA career. He went on to shoot 82% from the foul line, making it the 6th year in a 7-year stretch that he shot at least 80% from the foul line as a small forward. Alongside his 22 points per game, he would go on to average 5.7 rebounds, 3.3 assists. He would average 2 steals a game for the first time in his career. Following that 2017-2018 season, he would go on to be named an All-Star for what will be the 5th year in a row. He would go on to make the All-NBA 3rd team for the 4th time in his career as well, establishing himself as a top 15 player in this league consecutively. And once the Thunder would go on to make the playoffs, they would actually lose that series in 6 to the Utah Jazz, as the Jazz would see Donovan Mitchell have an out-of-body playoff experience. But then, of course, taking a look at how Paul George would fare specifically within that series, I mean, he averaged about 24 points, 6 rebounds. But following that series, Paul George would, of course, return for his second and final season with the Oklahoma City Thunder. In his age 28 season, his ninth season in the league, he would go on to start all 77 of the games he played for an Oklahoma City Thunder team that would go on to finish with a 49-33 record, the sixth best record in the West at the time. But in that season, Paul George would establish himself as an MVP candidate. His second season in Oklahoma City with Russ as his point guard would see him average about 36 minutes a game. His points would jump up from 21.9 to 28 points per game, which is his career high. He went on to average 28 points a game while shooting 43% from the field. He shot 38% from three, which would, of course, be the eighth year in a row that he would go on to shoot at least 35% from three as a small forward. He went on to shoot 83% from the foul line, making it the fourth year in a row and a seventh year out of 8 that he would shoot at least 80% from the foul line. Alongside his 28 points, he averaged 8.2 rebounds, which is also a career high for him, the only time he's averaged at least 8 rebounds. This would also be the third time he's averaged at least 7, and the last time he's averaged 7. He would go on to average 4.1 assists. This would be the third time he had averaged 4 assists at that point in his career. He would go on to average 2.2 steals. The second year in a row that he averaged at least 2 steals. This would be the only time in his career that he's actually led the NBA in a statistical category. And following that season, Paul George would be named an All-Star for the 4th year in a row, for the 6th full year in a row, excluding that year in which he was hurt. And then following that 2019 season, he would go on to be named to the All-NBA first team for the only time in his career, and he was named to the All-Defensive first team as well. It's very rare when you see a player get named to the top of both, but he was the NBA steals leader while putting up his career high in points. That would statistically be Paul George's best season to date. However, following that year, he would go on the Thunder would go on and then eventually lose to the to the Portland Trailblazers in 5 in this series, as Damian Lillard ended up hitting one of the craziest shots you'll ever see in a playoff series. But that is, of course, how that series ended. And following that season, Paul George's contract would come to an end as he would go on to... Actually, he got traded by the Thunder to the Clippers for Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Danilo Gallinari, and 5 first-round picks. And taking a look at how he's been playing with the Clippers, his hometown team, he's currently on the Los Angeles Clippers. His very first season with the LA Clippers was his 10th season in the NBA in 2019-2020. He would start all 48 of the games he played in a season where the LA Clippers would go on to finish with a 49-23 record. They did go on to finish the season. They shortened the season because of COVID, of course. This is the season in which Montrezl Harrell won the Sixth Man of the Year and Kawhi Leonard was the All-Star Game MVP. And, of course, Paul George was dealing with shoulder surgery, so he was dealing with that. But in the 48 games he played, he would average about 30 minutes a game. He would average 21.5 points, making it the 6th full season in a row that he averaged at least 20 points. He did all this while shooting 49% from the field. He shot 41% from 3. This would be the third time that he had done so in his career, including his injured season. He would go on to shoot 87% from the foul line, and he would go on to average 21.5 points, 5.7 rebounds, 3.9 assists, and he averaged 1.4 steals, making it so that he would have 5 straight seasons of averaging at least a steal a game. He would go on to go and finish that season as the LA Clippers would go on to beat the Mavericks in the first round of the playoffs just to lose in the second round to the Denver Nuggets after they were up 3-1 in the series. Following that 2019-2020 season, Paul George would return for his second season with the Clippers in his age 30 season in 2020-2021. In his second season with the Clippers, he started 54 of the games he played in a season where the Clippers would finish with a 47-25 record, the 4th best record in the Western Conference. In the season, Paul George would go, and this would be the season in which Paul George played the most games that he's played for the Clippers in a season, even including this one. He would go on to average about 34 minutes a game. he would finish averaging 23 points per game. Of course, this would be the 7th year in his career that he would average at least 20. He would shoot 46% from the field in a full-ish season, which would go down as his career high. He shot 41% from three. This would be the 3rd full season that he played in which he would go on to shoot at least 40. The 2nd most full season in which he would go on to shoot 40% from three. He would go on to shoot 86% from the foul line. This would be, of course, a constant that he maintained 6 years straight, and 9 full years if you're not counting the last 9 full years if you're not counting the injury year. Alongside his 23 points, Paul George averaged 6.6 rebounds, 5.2 assists, and he also averaged just over a steal per game. At the end of the 2021 season, Paul George was named an All-Star for the 7th time in his NBA career. I mean, being named an All-Star for the 7th time in an 11-year stretch for the vast majority of your career is a very big accomplishment. And in addition to that, the Los Angeles Clippers would go on into the playoffs where they would beat the Mavericks in 7. They would go on to beat the Jazz in 6 games before eventually losing in the conference finals to the Phoenix Suns. But of course, following that series, the LA Clippers would, of course, return for this most recent season where they are already eliminated. But looking at how Paul George's last full season fared in his 12th season in the league in his age 31 season and his 3rd season with the LA Clippers, he only went on to start 31 games for an LA Clippers team that would finish with the 8th best record in the West at 42-40. Going into the playoffs, Paul George did miss a good chunk of this season. He did miss it because he had suffered a torn UCL in his right elbow, one of his serious ligaments that you need, for shooting. But following that, or within that shortened season, in the 31 games he played, he would average about 35 minutes a game. Paul George would go on to average 24 points per game. That would be the 8th year in a row and the 9th full year in a row that he's averaged at least 20 in a season. He's doing this while shooting 42% from the field, which is about on par with what he's doing. He's doing this while shooting 35% from three, which was about on par with a good chunk of his other seasons. And of course, this would go on. Considering Paul George's shooting is something that really goes underrated with him, this was about the 11th year in a row that he shot at least 35% from three. The only year in which he did it was his rookie season, which is understandable. He went on to shoot 85% from the foul line, as only his rookie season and his injury season he didn't shoot at least 80% from the foul line. This is the 3rd year in a row he's shooting at least 85% from the free throw line. This is the 6th time he's doing so in his career. Alongside his 24 points per game, Paul George went on to average 6.9 rebounds, 5.7 assists, which would go down as the most assists that he would record in a season, and his 2.2 steals is on par with his career high that he registered in his last season in Oklahoma City in 2019. But this leads us to where we are now, as the Clippers did have a chance to play in the play-in game. They ended up losing to the Timberwolves, and they ended up losing to the New Orleans Pelicans as well, as the Clippers would end up knocking themselves out, as Paul George didn't really have a chance to really compete with them there. But I do think that Paul George should probably be somewhat ready to play a good chunk of the games next year. I'm not sure if he'll be completely ready because UCL might be a more serious injury than I think it is. But with that said, I do want to thank the ESPN, the NBA, and College Basketball Reference websites for giving me all the facts and figures that I need. With that said, today is May 2nd. Once all of today's exhibitions and matchups are done, I'm going to come back tomorrow on Tuesday, May 3rd. So until then, I want to thank everyone for listening once again. I do hope all is well. And if you ever really end up getting the chance to watch him, he's currently wearing number 13 for the Clippers, hence his nickname PG-13. Not to mention that he also won a gold medal in the Olympics. Paul George he's done a really good job of helping the game expand. And as a player, I do think that as a two-way player, he probably deserves a little bit more respect than he gets, but I do think that people that watch basketball do acknowledge Paul George as an elite two-way basketball player, which is the whole point of this video. Thanks for listening. I do hope all is well, and I wish you all have a great rest of your day, even though you're going to be hearing this days, months, years from now. Thanks for listening. I hope all is well. Thanks for listening to my piece. Happy birthday to Paul George, and peace out.